Good afternoon. Let's get started. Our speaker next week will be Professor Sheila Olmsted, who is an associate professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs here. She will talk to us about the impacts of shale gas development on surface water quality. This was a paper that was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences just a few months ago, and the results are very insightful as well as quite influential. So please join us next week for that discussion. It's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Paulina Jaramillo, and I made sure that I pronounce that correctly. Paulina is an assistant research professor at Carnegie Mellon University. She received her master's and a PhD degree in civil and environmental engineering both from Carnegie Mellon in 2004 and 2007 respectively. She has done a lot of work on life cycle assessment of energy systems, and much of her current work now focuses on multidisciplinary research on better understanding how social, economic, and environmental issues of energy consumption impact our energy systems, and also on public policy tools that can be used to support and design more sustainable energy infrastructure and consumption. She's also the executive director of the Renew Elect project, which, among other things, tries to ensure that as the nation transitions to more use of intermittent and variable renewable power, that happens in a cost-effective and reliable manner. So it's a great pleasure to have you here, Paulina.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for coming. So I'll be talking today about plug-in vehicles and the life cycle, air emissions, and all displacement benefits of plug-in vehicles. This is a paper that was published 2 years ago, and it's the first time I give this talk, so I had to go back and remember what we did. So sometimes if you ask something that I don't remember, I'll just say, I'll get back to you. But before I do that, I need to acknowledge a lot of the people that I work with. Carnegie Mellon is doing a lot of work on energy systems and sustainability. We have many different institutes, and it turns out that if you're doing any energy work, you're in one of these or in all of them. So I work with the Green Design Institute, the Carnegie Mellon Electricity Industry Center. I think Jay Abt, you mentioned, was here last year, and he's the director of that center. For the last couple of years, I've been managing the Renew Elect project, looking at the integration of renewables into the grid. We also have an NSF-sponsored center called the Climate Energy Decision-Making Center. So that's one of the big centers NSF has funded, and we've had it for it's a 5-year center, and we hope to renew it. I've also worked, and the lead author of this paper is Jaramillo. He's the director of the Vehicle Electrification Group at Carnegie Mellon University. And finally, our latest addition to this whole thing is the Scott Institute for Energy Innovation. This is a large institute that has just been funded last year, and it's an umbrella for all the work that is taking place. And we're very excited, and I'll show you something a little bit later about this center. So my group, I just named my group because also I'm now a tenure track faculty. So I called it the Climate Impacts Mitigation and Adaptations in the Energy Sector, CLIMA. Well, actually I call it CLIMA. If anyone speaks Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Romanian, Latin, CLIMA means climate in all of those languages. So I thought this was great. I found this. How original of me. So I have 10 PhD students currently and 1 postdoctoral fellow. Now, all of these students work with me, and in CMU, most of the students have co-advisors that actually are active participants in the research. So generally, when I meet with my PhD students, it's me and 1 or 2 other faculty every week. So that's what's really good about being a member of Carnegie Mellon. So I was telling earlier, I'm a civil engineer. I'm looking a lot at electric systems. So I work with a power systems engineer, and sometimes with a mechanical engineer, and sometimes with an econometrician. So this is my group because I wanted a website and a cool name like this, but I work with a lot of people, and they all deserve their recognition. So before I went into these, into the big presentation, I also wanted to let you know that there's a lot of work. Since I have 10 graduate students, we're working on a lot of issues, so I wanted to show you some of the papers that have come up in the last year and a half. I had a student that looked at the production costs and air emission impacts of coal cycling in power systems with large-scale wind penetration. We've looked at the effect of long-distance interconnection of wind power variability, and maybe Jay talked about that last year. We've also looked at what happens with coal plant retirements, what happens to SO2, NOx, and life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. There's a lot of regulations coming up from EPA that will probably force a lot of coal power plants to retire, so we wanted to quantify what those benefits are. Same thing we did something similar, natural gas. I started working on issues related to natural gas in 2005, when natural gas was $14 per million BTU, and we were going to be importing all of our natural gas because we didn't have any, and now natural gas is at $3 per million BTU. So that has really changed the playing field, and natural gas is increasingly being a primary source of electricity. So we looked at what, in the short term, what the reductions of emissions were from these changes. This is the paper I'm going to be talking about today. So it's called Valuation of Plugging Vehicle Life Cycle Air Emissions and Oil Displacement Benefits. Jaramillo, it was published in the Proceedings of the National Academies in 2011. The lead author is Jaramillo, and then there were 3 other senior researchers working on this paper. The supporting information, when we submitted this, it was going to be a really quick paper. We had everything we needed, and it was going to be like 3 months, and it became like a year and a half. When we submitted the manuscript, it had 60 pages of supporting information. So there was a lot of analysis going through these. We had someone looking at the vehicle themselves. I was looking a lot about the electricity and emissions from the electricity and from oil refineries, and someone looking at batteries and what the emissions from batteries manufacturing. So the paper is available online, and the Excel spreadsheet that we created that has all of the data is also available online with the paper. So there you can go and, try to figure out how the Excel spreadsheet, working with other people's spreadsheets is really always very difficult. It's kind of a nightmare, really. But it's available if you want to go and play and have time to do that. So why vehicle electrification? There has been a lot of discussion about vehicle electrification in the last 10 years. One of my co-authors wrote one of the first papers looking at life cycle of electric vehicles. And now we have so many different options. So a conventional vehicle, where most people in the US have, is powered with gasoline. I have a Toyota Prius. So my Toyota Prius is a hybrid electric vehicle. It runs on gasoline. It is not plugged in. It just has regenerative charging. There are now available plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. These are vehicles that can be plugged into the wall and run on gasoline and electricity. So their electric range is higher than the hybrid electric vehicle. And then there's the full electric vehicle, like the Nissan Leaf and the Tesla, which actually I saw one recently. You don't see them that often in Pittsburgh, but I saw one. Just driving, not in a showroom, but driving. So in general, the benefits that we talk about when we think about plug-in vehicles is that they offset gasoline use, and for people that are worried about trade deficits and oil security, so plug-in vehicles have the opportunity of reducing oil dependency. A lot of the discussion, however, has been focused on how it reduces emissions of both greenhouse gases that contribute to climate change and emissions of criteria pollutants. There are some trade-offs. And when you talk to lay people, and sometimes they say, well, electric vehicles have no emissions. And I always look at them and I say, because I have a lot of friends that have never really done any of this work, and I say, well, yeah, true when you're driving there are no emissions, but where do you think the electricity comes from? And most of our electricity comes from fossil fuels, so there are emissions at the power plants. So with this paper, what we were trying to do is look at the life cycle of the vehicle, including battery production, the vehicle manufacturing, the gasoline, the upstreams from the gasoline, so gasoline, oil and gas production, and refineries, and electricity generation, and then finally the emissions at the tailpipe. We did not look at end of life, I should clarify, so we did not look at what happens to the batteries or the vehicles at the end of life. So this is just some pictures of the vehicles that are available and their ranges. So the Prius that I have has a range of about 6, I think these are miles. But the bigger, the Tesla Model S, it's, actually no, I think these are kilometers. The Tesla model can go up to 265 kilometers on an electric battery. Longer distances means you use, with electricity means you use less gasoline. They are more expensive, but with every, like with every technology, costs are going down and are expected to continue going down. Some of these cars are heavier and could lead to lower efficiencies, so we try to look at some of that. And then, are there more emissions from manufacturing the batteries itself? So these are all the things that we try to look at. Before, the U.S. government has seen the value on these vehicles and has provided incentives. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009 provided subsidies for the electric vehicles, and I looked yesterday, and these subsidies are actually still at these levels. I think they're coming close to their end, but they were still, I looked at the federal government website and it says they're still active. So it's $2,500 for the plug-in hybrid and $7,500 for the Volt and the Nissan Leaf. So the federal government has definitely has decided, someone, the federal government, I don't know, has decided that there's value in supporting these technologies, and they're doing these through subsidies. So before I go into the details of of everything we've done, I wanted to point out that there has been a lot of work. There's a lot of work going on this area and has been published. So I wanted to focus a little bit on what the studies say are the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions of vehicles. Maybe I will use this if it works. Yeah. So this is the first paper. It's from Samaras. It's one of my co-authors, and he did his PhD at Carnegie Mellon also. He's now at Rand, and he was one of the first people to look at the life cycle benefits of hybrid vehicles. And then we did something. This paper is from 2011. This paper came out of Hawkins. He's now at EPA. Was also at Carnegie Mellon University, if I can say we're awesome. He's actually a very good friend. He worked in Norway for a couple of years, so this was a paper really focused on electric vehicles for the European market and the different battery technologies. There was a paper also from last year, so you'll see there's two, these ones from last year, and then there's two these years, all looking at these. And in general, the ranges are somewhat different, and I did find that our ranges for when we have the pessimistic electricity generation scenario, our numbers are much higher, but they're all within a similar range. So are these slides going to be available? Yeah, okay. So we extended, most of the work has been done on life cycle of greenhouse gas emissions. And the main reason that a lot of the focus has been on life cycle greenhouse gas emissions is that greenhouse gases are global pollutants. The impact of an emission of CO2 here in Austin is the same as the impact of an emission of CO2 in Pittsburgh. So you can do additive inventories, and that makes it CO2, if you're doing life cycle, it's so nice, it's just add them up. With other pollutants and other impact categories, they're very location dependent. So if you are reducing emissions of nitrogen oxides in Austin, the benefits of that are not necessarily the same as the cost of increasing emissions in the middle of nowhere, because the costs of emissions of criteria air pollutants are very location dependent. So we're using a valuation model to be able to account for the life cycle costs, externality costs of these vehicles. We're looking at vehicle and battery production, gasoline production and distribution, electricity production and distribution, and vehicle operations. In each of these phases, we looked at the externality costs of emissions. We looked at the main criteria emissions are carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxides, volatile organic compounds, PM2.5 and PM10, and sulfur dioxide, and then we looked at greenhouse gas emissions. We also looked at externality costs of petroleum consumption. We used all of our data is from publicly available sources. The GREET model is the most widely used model. It's from Oregon National Lab. It's the most widely used model to look at the environmental impacts of vehicles and pathways. So this is where we got a lot of our data. For the power plant, we got data from the INGRID model or the INGRID database from the Environmental Protection Agency that reports emissions from all power plants in the United States. The National Household Travel Survey, which is a big survey that is performed by the government. They did surveys of like 160,000 households and looked at driving patterns. So we used these to identify driving distances and ranges of how much the car is operated in electricity driving mode. And then there was a report in 2010 from the National Academies. The title was The Hidden Costs of Energy. They quantified the externality damages to human health, crops, buildings from energy production. And they used something called the APEEP model. The APEEP model was built by a professor now at Mulberry College. He's an economist. And it gives you, actually I have data. So the air pollution, you have all in our life cycle, we have all of these sources of pollution. We have the cars driving in some point of the country, and then power plants are here, and then oil and gasoline refineries are here. So the air pollution model, the APEEP model, takes an inventory of emissions from all sources. It uses a Gaussian plume model of transport, so it uses a chemical model to estimate air pollution, and looks at the species transformation and chemical modeling. And then looking at the increases in ambient concentrations by county, it produces increased risk from increased emissions. And then what it gives us is a $1 per ton value of the damages associated with the different pollutants in each county of the United States. So we get dollars per ton of SO2 emissions in whatever county Austin is in, and also what in the county where Pittsburgh is in. So it has the cost of emission at different levels. So vehicles are area sources of pollution or mobile sources of pollution. The cost of those sources are higher than the cost of emitting at higher levels, at stack height. So it incorporates those things. I should mention that I'm presenting the results from the paper that was published in 2011. Since then, the developer of the APEEP model has updated his model. It's now called the AP2 model. He has expanded it and now includes emission damages from 2002, 2005, and 2008. The PM10 emissions are not included anymore, but damages from SO2 and PM2.5 increased significantly. This is a result of a more detailed atmospheric chemistry model, but also a different dose response. And these really increased, SO2 really increased because SO2 is a driver of secondary particulate matter formation. So, and the dose response for PM2.5 really changed. So the cost of those pollutants really changed. We are working on updating the paper that I'm presenting today with this new model, but that work is not ready to be presented. So there is this caveat that I'm using the APEEP model that was available in 2010, and there's an updated model that we're planning to or working on using now. We used an emission cost for greenhouse gases, so it's the social cost of carbon. We used a range between $14 and $140 per ton, per metric ton of CO2 equivalent, and the median, which is where I will be focusing most of the results, was $42 per metric ton of CO2 equivalent. These are costs based on global damages, not only U.S. damages. As I mentioned, we did externality costs from oil consumption. So the literature has identified 3 different types of oil premium costs. There's the cost of supply disruption, what happens if the cost of losing the oil that we are using. There's something called monopsony, and I don't know if I actually don't know if I pronounced that right. But that is, while there really are not several buyers of oil, the U.S. is the leading purchaser of oil, and that's changing in the future with China and India growing. But up to now, the U.S. has had such a big market share in the purchase of oil that they have driven prices up. So the theory is that if the U.S. wasn't buying as much oil, the price of oil will go down, and so we're paying a premium for such a large consumption. So there have been some papers, and there was this paper from 2007 that quantify the cost of this mechanism. And this one can be a little debatable, but it has been in the literature listed as the costs of military spending to protect oil supplies. This is a little bit controversial, but it has been listed in the literature, so it's part of our analysis. So going into the results, these are base case. So here we have every stage of the life cycle. So like vehicle production, it's the same. The vehicle itself, we looked at comparable vehicles, so it's the same vehicle. So the emissions from the production these are damages in the y-axis. So this is the net present value of the damages. We assumed 12-year lifetime of the vehicle. So over 12 years, the net present value of the damages from these vehicles are in the y-axis. So it's the same, about $1,000 for vehicle production. Battery production, this is where you start seeing differences, because the larger the battery, the more the emissions from battery production. And so we had to make assumptions about the location of where the plants are manufacturing, and we did several sensitivity analysis. What kind of electricity is used when they're manufacturing these batteries. Gasoline consumption, obviously, it's higher in conventional vehicles, and then in electric vehicles, there's nothing. Then electricity production, and here, this is the base case. We're using the average electricity emission factor for the data from this came from eGrid 2007. So that was for the 2007 grid. And that includes the average, weighted average damages from all electricity. So it includes where the electricity was generated, so because everything, the damages for SO2 and PM2.5 and the criteria pollutants are location dependent, we had to do a weighted average. And then vehicle operation, again, the CV that's where all the oil premiums are and has higher emissions at the tailpipes. So you will notice that for the battery production, SO2 drives the damages. And that's probably a result of the assumption about the grid emission. And you see that too in the electricity production. SO2 damages are the yellow, so there's the damages from SO2 are also pretty big there. SO2 has pretty big damages, again, like I said, because the SO2 is a precursor to particulate matter, which is a particulate matter 2.5, which it has been associated with a lot of health damages, and it's responsible for cardiovascular and respiratory diseases. So that's why SO2 is, the damages are heavier. And you do have, from electricity generation, since this was in 2007, there was probably more coal generation then than now, so the greenhouse gases there are higher. That doesn't show us the total. This is by life cycle stage. The total is here. So the base case, this is the base case, is what I just showed you. So this is but total for all stages. And what you see in the base case is that the full electric vehicle SO2 from the average grid really drives the damages, and so that vehicle, under our assumptions, provides you with very little benefits in terms of damages associated with pollution and oil consumption. And also interesting to note is that the hybrid with a 60-kilometer range is very similar to the conventional, just a regular hybrid. In the optimistic scenario where you have zero emissions at the power plant, zero emission electricity at the power plant, so for somehow in Texas you have a lot of wind at night and you're charging your vehicles at night, so the marginal emission factor of charging your vehicle is zero. That's what this scenario would show. The electric vehicle, full range electric vehicle now is the lowest of them all. It still has SO2 damages because there is electricity used in the rest of the life cycle, so in the production of the battery and the production of the vehicle, and so that shows up. But all of the in the best case scenario, all of the electric vehicles, the plug-in vehicles, are definitely better than the conventional vehicles and slightly better than the hybrid electric vehicles. If you're using a coal-fired power plant, then the electric vehicles, the full electric vehicles, really are much worse. And this is the worst coal-fired power plant in the US in 2007. So it's a pessimistic scenario, and this is a very optimistic scenario. So this is more of a bounding analysis. Again, SO2 is a big contributor of the damages associated with the pure electric vehicle. So maybe I'm going too fast, but in summary, so some of the conclusions are that the bigger vehicles are not necessarily better. Large batteries in our model are, with the data that we have, are worse on average, and they are only marginally better when you have the best source of electricity at charging. Tax credit overemphasizes the benefits of the larger batteries. And in reality, a lot of these benefits you can get from the smaller plug-in vehicles and the conventional hybrid vehicles. Jeremy really likes saying this, small is beautiful. More batteries doesn't necessarily mean it's more green. Large packs are often underutilized, and this is based on his analysis of the National Travel Household Surveys. And you have to account, when you're thinking about these issues, you have to account for extra emissions from production and the weight. If we're talking about public policy, you want to look at how much you can do with the money that we're using, that we're using to provide tax benefits. What you find is that the amount of money that you get, so with the cost of the electric vehicles at that time, you can buy less cars with $1.5 billion, less electric vehicle cars with $1.5 billion, and your benefits are lower. So what this is suggesting is that you can incentivize the purchase of more hybrid and small plug-in vehicles and get more benefits from that $1.5 billion. I guess this is repeating some of that. But I wanted to, so just There is some work, like I said, this is from 2011, and I'm presenting it because I think it's still a very interesting and relevant paper, and because I had not had that chance to present it. So I was really excited that there was a lot of interest here on electric vehicles, and I would get a chance to present it. But we are looking at what happens to the grid when you're charging, smart charging of electric vehicles. So what I mean by smart charging is regulating the charge rate to follow the variability of wind. And we have a paper forthcoming in Applied Energy. And like I said, we are updating this paper that I just presented to use unit commitment and dispatch models of the power system and update the AP2 damages. So we're hoping to have something by the end, a draft to be sent out for publication by the end of the year. And I wanted to leave you with something that just got published from CMU. And I think the volume is working.
Perhaps you're thinking of purchasing a hybrid or plug-in electric vehicle. After all, you care about the environment, and this seems a good way to help. But are you really helping the environment? To answer this question, you must first answer a question of your own. What kind of driving do you do? If you drive in heavy city traffic, a hybrid or plug-in electric vehicle could cut your greenhouse gas emissions in half while saving you money over the vehicle's life. But if you spend most of your time cruising on the highway, hybrid and plug-in electric vehicles offer little environmental benefit. They just cost more. So before you buy, consider how you drive. And for those of you considering going fully green with a plug-in electric vehicle, you should know that gasoline hybrids are often the cleaner option today. This might change in the future, however, as we switch to cleaner sources of electricity, like wind power. At Carnegie Mellon University's Scott Institute for Energy Innovation, we're helping policymakers and consumers make wise decisions based on scientific and technical information. You can help.
So this is the Scott Institute, as I said, was just created a year ago, and one of the big goals of the Institute is to put the research that we're working on out there to policymakers and to just the public in general. So this is one of two videos that have been recently produced. The other one is on batteries, not electric batteries for vehicles, but just storage for the grid. So if you want to see the other video that is very similar, it's cmu.edu/energy. So I thought I would put it up because that's Jeremy summarizing what I presented just in whatever that was, 2 minutes, and it's cute. The dog is our mascot, the Scotty dog. So if you have more information, if you want more information about what we do, what I do, and a complete list of papers, you can go to my website, and then from there you can also go to, I have links to everything else that is going on at Carnegie Mellon related to energy research. And that's what I have.
There's a lot of research going on relating to battery and battery technologies for storage and in vehicles and for grid storage. I was just wondering how major changes in battery technology would influence this model if there was a doubling of capacity for lithium-ion batteries or something like that.
Well, so batteries, more efficient batteries and more cleaner batteries batteries that are produced in better facilities would definitely benefit these. When you mean new technologies, you mean like new materials being used, or?
Either new materials or more efficient lithium-ion batteries. Because I know that technology seems to be advancing year to year, like 6 to 7% or something. So.
Okay. So I mean, the more efficient batteries, if they need less electricity per mile, then obviously that's going to improve the benefits of the electric vehicles. In terms of the materials, that's a deeper question, because then you have to look at what type of materials, what kind, how much does it, what's the energy cost of manufacturing these batteries with more advanced materials. Just because there are newer materials doesn't necessarily mean they're environmentally friendlier. So that, I don't really have a good sense for that aspect, but the more efficient batteries would definitely, I mean, if you have more efficient, anything more efficient in here will make things better.
Hi, I was just wondering, how would you like cut SO2 emissions with the battery increases of, like, if we do more plug-in vehicles and stuff like that? What are some technologies that could cut that?
In order to cut SO2 emissions from the battery, you have to cut emissions from electricity generation. Right? So there is a cap and trade program for SO2, and there are more strict rules coming up for SO2. And as we move away from coal, you're going to be reducing emissions of sulfur dioxide. So a reduction of sulfur dioxide emissions in the power generation system would really change the results and would really make the electric vehicles much better, since sulfur dioxide is such a big component. I have to say, however, that the AP2 model that came up with bigger, like new numbers, had a much higher cost for SO2. So that's still, I mean, I can't say how much, because we have to look at how much the changes in sulfur dioxide have been in the power plants since we use these, but also there's the reduction in sulfur dioxide that has taken place, but an increase in the average damages as a result of the more complete or comprehensive or better dose response model. So, but if you move to wind, there's no sulfur dioxide, then that's much better.
First of all, thanks a lot for coming down. It was great to hear you talk. I was wondering, obviously, so you have the four categories basically of vehicles, but obviously there's a lot of heterogeneity in the within groups variance. I'm wondering how you modeled that, what the actual distributions look like.
Yeah, so these analyses is looking comparable vehicles, right? One of the problems with life cycle analysis is the definition of a functional unit. You have to be able to compare a vehicle that provides the same service. So if you're comparing an SUV to a smart car, many would argue that the level of service is not the same, so it's not a fair comparison. So the way we did that was to look at vehicles that are comparable in the level of service. So they're, what is it? Like, what's a Prius? They're cars that are comparable to a Prius. We didn't have an SUV in here or a really super compact car. Not like the distribution of the total emissions. So this is a comparison on a vehicle per vehicle basis. This is one vehicle compared to the next. On terms of the total damages associated with the transportation sector or with vehicles, then we would have to look at the distribution of the vehicles, and that changes, right? There is a lot of heterogeneity.
I guess I mean like in the within, so you're saying that like this vehicle is similar to this one.
In these analyses.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
But there might be like 10 or 20 cars that satisfy that kind of similar to Prius in the conventional.
Well, so we looked at vehicles that had similar mileage. Yeah, I mean, yes. But we looked at vehicles within the same mileage range for gasoline vehicles. And so I think it was the Honda Civic. I think it was the Honda Civic, for the conventional vehicle, we looked at both an Honda Civic and a Volkswagen, which you can say provides the same level of service as a hybrid as a plug-in or a Prius. It's the same type of car. But I mean, obviously, yeah, if you have a, I don't know, what's the worst compact car? Which one? Which one? No, that's actually pretty efficient, but I don't know, like the worst, I don't know. Yeah, well, diesels are pretty efficient, but, right, I mean, you are going to get that, but we try to choose comparable vehicles, and that's just the limitation of the life cycle.
Sorry, just to be clear, you chose one vehicle across the spectrum.
Right.
Thanks. I was wondering if you had done any of the, so the net difference between the cost of that pollution versus the cost of remediation or anything like that to get what the difference is right now, and kind of, it'd be interesting to track the gap between...
The cost of remediation?
Right, just to see what the net gap is between the two in terms of, when the cost of that emissions might outweigh the costs of remediation to where it might become useful to do that.
So you're looking at the cost effectiveness of control technologies, pretty much.
Yeah, I was just curious if you had overlaid that at any time. Or
I have not looked at the cost effectiveness of control technologies.
Also, thanks for coming here this week. I have a question sort of on the different types of damages you compared across them. So you have sort of something ranging from, I assume, the U.S. military costs of maintaining oil sea lanes, which would theoretically be borne by American consumers, and then greenhouse gas emissions, which theoretically are borne by everyone in the world, and then localized emissions as well, which are, I guess, U.S.-based as well. So how do you think about these different spatial variations? You kind of mentioned this at the beginning, the difficulty of adding different things on different spatial scales, but when we add in a non-health aspect like paying more for gas because we have nuclear aircraft carriers in the Gulf, then how do we
Yeah, so these are the social costs to the U.S. We account it as the social cost to the U.S., right? So pollution, and then the oil ones I have a harder time talking about them because that's actually I'm not as familiar with. But the criteria pollutants, right, they are the social damages to the U.S. of emissions in a particular county. So there are social costs, and the idea is that it's a cost to society in general. I mean, I guess there's an ethical question there about, like, am I responsible for the cost of a life of someone in Pittsburgh if I live in Austin? But I'm not going there. This is what externality costs, and the definition of the social cost is, this is the cost in losing, so there's something in here called the value of a statistical life, so how much do we value statistical life? We don't value someone in Austin more than we value someone in Pittsburgh in this model, right? Someone dies here or dies in Pittsburgh, it's the same cost. So who is actually paying for these costs? That's why we call it the social cost. It's society at large. There's no money necessarily trading hands here, right? You could argue that there's some healthcare expenses or that we're paying, but this is why we call them social costs. We're not allocating that cost to one single person or one single state. These are just costs to society in general. And I think what you're talking about, that just gets more philosophical than I can go to.
Hi, thank you again. Excellent work, very excellent work. Appreciate it. Couple things. So on your next generation, will you do some derating factor on the tax credit? I noticed in the paper it assumed 7,500 maximum times the number of vehicles. It's 200,000 per manufacturer before it runs out. So there's still a lot of runway. But for example, I didn't get all of the 7,500 personally because I had other credits. And I'm sure that if you look at the buyers right now, that probably isn't uncommon. So it's kind of unfair just to put the cap on that. What was the vehicle life assumption as far as number of miles?
150,000 miles.
Okay, right in the net, okay. And then was this the worst of coal? That
Yes.
So what would the numbers look like with the average coal or the coal that may be put in place with the new emissions requirements that are, what, 1,100 pounds per?
It will be somewhere between here and here.
Okay. Okay. Yes, that's a good question. Good thing. And then what kind of assumption, this is static scoring, I'm not sure if that's the right phrase for this, but what kind of assumption are you going to use for decline in battery prices combined with improvements in energy density per year and the compounding effect? How far forward might you look in your subsequent analysis as far as battery prices? Because it's very interesting to look at what Tesla's doing and the other trends. It's very aggressive.
So like looking at the marginal cost of the vehicle associated with the battery?
Well, you look at the battery prices, which drive the cost, yes.
Right. So I haven't really worked on batteries, so we didn't do much with the cost of batteries here, because these are just social costs. That the cost of manufacturing the battery is a private cost, so that's not included here. What can we do about that? I don't know, but you can contact the Vehicle Electrification Group at Carnegie Mellon, and they're doing a lot of work on battery technology.
My advice is that you might want to look at a lot of the aggressive numbers that have come out lately as far as actually more aggressive price declines than what were expected in the National Academy studies. As far as Tesla's claiming, it seems like that they're already near or under $200 per kilowatt hour.
For the battery.
For the battery.
Right.
But, you have to, is that really with the battery management system, sometimes you've got to really do that. And the monopsony discussion is very interesting because absolutely as the consumer of 25% or so of the world's oil, we make a difference. But it seems like that, and Carrie can elaborate on this, there's some dynamics there where the Saudis can basically shift the supply curve, and all we're doing is, if we save, they just shift back in the supply curve to support the price.
Yeah.
And so there could be some dynamics there. And then David Green's estimates as far as the military cost might be something worthwhile to look at too.
And then, and honestly, quite honestly, I'm not going there personally. And for something like the oil market, you need a computational equilibrium, general equilibrium model. And even those are black boxes that no one really knows how they work and how the market will react. And so I understand your point, but I'm not going there. And I'm not convinced that we reduce our consumption and China is not just going to keep increasing their consumption.
Right.
So we used what was in the literature. I don't know why. I don't know why we push so much for the oil part, but.
Yes, just building off several comments that we have heard, and you have a bounded analysis like lower bound, upper bound, but then there are also lots of sensitivities. For example, evolution of battery technologies in different types of plants. What type of sensitivity analysis was done? And I imagine there were 60 pages of supporting information, so a lot of that happened. But what did you find were the most important sensitivities here?
The emissions from the power plants are the most. And you can just see these here. But also, the efficiency of the battery, and the efficiency of the gasoline vehicles, right? As we move into comparing vehicles that are comparable, right, and corporate fuel standards are increasing, we probably need to update some of our numbers. But I think definitely the most important are the emissions at the power plant and the efficiency of the vehicles themselves.
Is there a question over here?
Hi, thank you for coming. So for this data, you said the cost of those emissions, some of those emissions varied a lot from county to county.
Mm-hmm.
So for this data, what value did you use? And also, how would the data look if you use the cost in, say, more urban areas? Because, as the video said, that's where EVs make sense.
So this is for the coal-fired plant Okay, if greenhouse gases are easy. That's the coal plant with the worst greenhouse gas emissions. But that's also the coal plant with, so it's the 95th plant in terms of damages. So that's the plant with located in the most expensive, 95th percentile county in the U.S. So the bounding analysis here includes the location of the plant and the damages associated with that location. So that's like the worst of the worst.
Quick, simple question. What was the nominal driving behavior, miles per day, or what was the driving habit presumed? More or less.
I don't have that off the top of my head. I'm sorry. I was obsessing about the grams per mile of CO2, and because it turns out we didn't report. I was looking at the paper and I was like, where are the grams per mile? Like the life cycle CO2 per mile. It turns out we never reported that number directly. I had to go back and dig it out. So I was obsessing about that and forgot to look at those details in the supporting information. But we have it. And also, like I said, the spreadsheet is available and it includes all of the data that we used. So you can, if you're brave enough, and working with other, like I have had horrible experiences working with other people's spreadsheets, but it is available.
Thanks. Yeah, looking at that slide up there, I'm interested at the very high level of damages from SO2 pollution, even in the case of from a battery electric vehicle, even in the case of the zero-emission power plant. I must admit I know nothing at all about the process of manufacturing a battery, but where does that SO2 come from in simple terms?
Yeah, it's from the electricity used at the plants that manufacture the batteries. And when we looked at these, we looked at potential locations of battery manufacturing facilities in the U.S. So it's based on the counties, on an idea of the electricity that is being supplied to those.
Okay. So basically that is electricity consumption.
It is, but it's not electricity for charging the vehicle. It's electricity used at the plant, at the manufacturing plant.
Yeah.
Right.
So in the case of the zero-emission power plant, you're assuming zero emissions for charging.
For charging,
but
yeah.
Sort of base case emissions for manufacture of the batteries
right.
or something like that.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Just to sort of follow up, by the way, thanks for your presentation, it's really great. Just to follow up on that, what did you look at actually changing the emissions for manufacturing of the battery or manufacturing of the vehicle, or did you only use the base case for that portion?
No, I'm pretty sure we did the sensitivity, and I just don't have that on the top of my, I could look at the paper, but.
It's in the paper, those cases as well. Okay, great, thank you.
Great presentation. I have a question. You mentioned that you might be doing a unit commitment and dispatch model to look at some of these issues, and I'm wondering, do you have any insight yet into the temporal variability of charging your car, like how the emissions intensity changes if you charge in the middle of the night versus at the peak of the day? Do you have any sense of?
Yeah, so if you're charging in PJM at the middle of the night, you're charging with coal.
Right.
I think in Texas you're probably, actually I don't know in Texas. I haven't looked at Texas. But we've been looking at a PJM, and what we found is that control charging to delay until later at night increases emissions because you're charging with coal.
Great, thanks.
But PJM doesn't have that much wind.
I was wondering if, do you know an analysis if you use compressed natural gas in a car? How would the numbers would look?
I'm working on that, right? I have a student working on natural gas vehicles right now. Actually, I have another paper. The hybrid vehicles are better than the compressed natural gas vehicles. I have a figure for that also somewhere here. But we're doing a more thorough analysis about all of several pathways for natural gas fuels. But yeah, in general, the hybrid vehicles are better. We looked just at the conventional hybrid vehicle. They're better than the compressed natural gas vehicles.
But your natural gas vehicle can also be hybrid, right?
Right, we didn't look at that.
Ah, okay.
But are there any compressed natural hybrid vehicles? I've actually never heard of that. I mean, I think it could be done, but I haven't.
Actually, like any gas vehicle can be turned into natural gas, like pretty easy. Would be like, it's, I don't know here in the state how the laws is, the regulations, but it's like $800.
It's about $1,000.
$1,000, sorry, yeah. So if you have an electric gas vehicle, you can turn it to natural gas.
Yeah, okay. I don't know enough about vehicles to say whether that's true or not.
There's one more question. Let's make it the last question.
This is the last question. I was wondering how you came up with the figures for military spending on the cost on this.
That was one question she was hoping will not be asked.
No, I have it. The Lucci and Murphy 2008.
Got it. Thank you.